Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
I want to apologize for those who listen on podcast. Last week's class did not record due to technical difficulties on my end. It recorded, but it did not save, so it's lost. It got lost in the bowels of the interweb, which is unfortunate because I thought it was a pretty good review class. So I'm going to review the review in 5 minutes or less and then move forward. So this class is about shaping one's idea of God as it might involve or influence your daily davening. And last week, before we start Hasidut, which is what we're going to do this week, we kind of took a step back and took stock. And hi, Paul, we see you. And what I said was that I'm making a broad generalization. All religious systems deal with a short list of the big questions. And the big questions are, I think we had 4.5 of them. I don't remember. We came up with 4 or 5. What's out there beyond us? What am I supposed to do while I'm here? What happens after I die? I don't know. Those are the 3 I remember. Does anyone remember the other 1 or 2? What's out there beyond us? Beyond what we can see, touch, and taste? What are we supposed to do while we're here? What happens after I die? And I think we had 1 more. Anyway, so what we're talking about in this class is question 1. Once in a while it touches on those other questions, but generally why is there suffering and evil? That was another important one, right? That was 4, question 4. Why is there suffering and evil in the world? So we're talking about, in this class, we've been talking for getting on close to 2 years. Question number 1, what's out there beyond us? And we said that most religions, at least that I'm familiar with, and certainly Judaism, generally answer that question in the language of myth, which is the language of story. And there are people who say that this is because we are the storytelling mammal. That's how our mind operates. And so we tell stories. We use the language of story. God took the dust of the earth and breathed into it. Or God unfolds down into the world through 10 levels down to our level. Or, if you're a pagan polytheist, the gods and goddesses are fighting about who is their favorite. Or God came down on a mountain and said 10 things, 10 important rules, and then another 611 subsequent rules. Because so all of these are stories, and they're attempts to capture what we can say about the ineffable. I think ineffable means something like in truly ununderstandable and incomprehensible. And I also said last week that I'm not a fundamentalist. I'm not a Jewish fundamentalist. So Jewish fundamentalists would say, all the other people's myths are just stories that they make up. Our myths are true with a capital T, factual with a capital F. And I'm not a Jewish fundamentalist, so I don't believe that. And I would just say, well, our stories are our ways of trying to answer that big question, those big questions. But again, in this class, we're focused on big question number 1. What's out there beyond what we're able to know with our 5 senses? And of course, we will eventually get to modernity and some thinkers who say there's nothing out there besides what we can apprehend with our 5 senses. We'll get there, I promise. So we're in the Middle Ages, early modernity. Okay, so we're about to talk about the rise of Hasidism and Hasidic thought. We talked about in medieval, we talked about the philosophers as exemplified by Maimonides Rambam, who was the anti-mythologizer par excellence. He said all of those things we say are just metaphors. because we are limited creatures. He would say, yes, we are the storytelling mammal, and we are limited to that. And that is why we're unable to know anything about God, because that's kind of because our thinking apparatus, feeling apparatus is limited. So all of that is metaphor. And he says also, just a corollary in Rambam, and our myths are a way to wean the folk, the simple people, away from the myths of the polytheists, the pagans, because their myths are intellectually and morally lower. I think Rambam would definitely say that. Lower, more primitive, more base. And so our myths are still mythical and metaphor, but it's the Jewish attempt to wean people away from the lower myths of paganism. Maimonides talks about that a lot. We're not going to talk about that. And then we started to talk about medieval Kabbalah, which really re-mythologizes. I don't know, you could say re-mythologize if you've read Rambam first. You could just say they ignore Rambam, okay? They think it's just wrong. And they go mythically in a different direction. So we talked about the Zohar, and we talked about the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria. So now we're moving on to Hasidut. Okay. So the era of the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the 1500s, we said was a time of great messianic expectation after the giant calamity of the expulsion from Spain, the destruction, as it were, or really the dismantling geographically of an incredibly great, vast, half a millennium Jewish civilization. This was historically cataclysmic for people. So the Kabbalah of Tzvat, which we shorthand by calling it Lurianic Kabbalah of the 1500s, was a mythical attempt to explain in cosmic terms, a cosmic reflection of a broken, damaged world, how it got to be that way, and what we're supposed to do to fix it. Tikkun. Okay? This led to further messianic expectations. Things are so bad that it's obviously times that it's the Messiah's time, the Messiah is going to come. This led to ended up to be a false Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi, in the 1600s, who ended up, he had many Jewish followers. He ended up converting to Islam. It was kind of a disaster ideologically for the Jewish people. And there was great crash after this. Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who is the rabbi at a yeshiva in Chicago, has a thing about this. She calls it crash theory. She basically says there's an ideology which makes sense. Then there's a crash. Crash could be like the destruction of the temple or the expulsion from Spain or a Messiah who turns out not to be a Messiah. And then out of the crash, people formulate a new ideology or set of ideas that make sense. So Shabtai Tzvi ended up being a crash. And then a new ideology gets formulated. And I'll just sort of point to three elements that go into this, into the rise of Hasidism. One, the loss of a sense that there is an imminent Messiah coming, meaning that we can change the world out there, that the world out there is going to change. Therefore, a sort of giving up on the idea that the world out there is going to change, and a focus on the only thing we can impact on, which is the world in here, inside each of us. So we have in Hasidism a renewed emphasis on the inner spiritual life of the individual. Yeah, the Messiah is going to come, but that's going to be eventually, and God has a lot to do with that. There's not a huge amount that we can do right now, and the Mashiach might not come tomorrow. Keep your suitcase packed under your bed, which has different meanings, of course, now for people in Los Angeles. In the wake of the wildfires. Keep your suitcase packed. Messiah is definitely going to come, in some unpredictable future. And so we got to live for the present. And the present is the inner spiritual life of the individual, rather than, as in Lurianic Kabbalah, the person's spiritual life is supposed to be directed at fixing the world out there. So one element is retreat from the idea that I can change the world out there, and I need to focus on the world inside myself. Number two was the situation of the Jews of Central Eastern Europe. Now, here's what I want to say, the rise of Hasidism. I'm really fuzzy. Like, I read books that say Podolia and Volhynia and Carpathia, and I'm not entirely sure where those places are. I know they're somewhere between Germany and Russia. Okay. But other than that, I'm fuzzy. You'll read about, first Hasidism was here, and then it moved to the Ukraine, which I do know is a country. I know that much. So I'm fuzzy about that. So I'm going to call it Central Eastern Europe, meaning it's not really Russia yet. Okay. In its beginnings. The situation of the Jews there was very impoverished for a variety of reasons. They were poor. Number three factor is internal social stressors, or internal social factors within that Jewish community. And this is what all the history books say. We had an emphasis on the learned elite. Learned means Talmud scholars. To be a Talmud scholar, you had to do that full time. That means someone had to support you financially, you and your family, so you being male and your family. And rich people, rich merchants would vie with each other for their daughters being able to marry these Talmud scholars. And the Talmud scholars had to marry a rich person's daughter so that they could continue to be supported in their Torah studies rather than being a shoemaker or a farmer, right? Tevye isn't able to go to yeshiva because Tevye is a poor milkman, all right? And so you had this kind of, cascading upwards. There's a word I can't think of right now. Elite of Torah scholars and rich families, and no one else could, of regular people, Tevye can't really aspire to this because Tevye is a milkman, because people were poor Central Eastern European peasants. Okay, so what's left for me? I'm left out. So we have these three factors. You can read this in any of the books that talk about the rise of Hasidism. A rising interest in the inner world rather than the outer world, inner spirituality. These are the three things that made the perfect storm. More interest in the inner world. The impossibility for most ordinary Jews to participate in a system that kind of valorized Talmud study, and which had to be coupled with a certain degree of wealth, and the material poverty and deterioration of the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe. Okay? So the history scholars say these are the factors that led to the rise of Hasidism. A little bit about time. When we're talking about rise of Hasidism, we're talking about the 1700s. Baal Shem Tov lived 1700 to 1760. He probably never wrote anything. He is attributed, the rise of Hasidism is attributed to him. That may or may not have been true. His first disciple was, he's called the Maggid. Maggid meant an itinerant preacher. Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezerich. He's called the Maggid of Mezerich, or simply just the Maggid. The Maggid died, I think, about 15 years after the Baal Shem Tov. And after the Maggid came what's called the third generation of Hasidim, and they were the first real Hasidic leaders, multiple ones, in the late 1700s. The first Hasidic book was not actually written until 1780. Okay, so Baal Shem Tov lived 1700 to 1760. First Hasidic books appear in the 1780s. So there's debate among the scholars about whether they're talking, about fantasies, about the original founders, like the Baal Shem Tov said this is sort of like George Washington chopped down the cherry tree. Okay. or is it actual historical memory? We're not going to go into any of that. And then scholars talk about, different generations of Hasidim and how different ideas evolve. We're not going to talk about any of that. Okay. One, because I'm not a historian of Hasidism, so I can't do it. The other is because, I'm going to say that for our purposes, that's not important. So we're going to look at Hasidic ideas in works from the late 1700s, really up through the early 1900s. The last book we'll look at is from, I think, the 1920s. Okay. And I am acknowledging that I'm homogenizing everything for our purposes. Okay. All of that was the preamble. And Hasidism is going to occupy us for a number of weeks. Okay. So idea number one, which I want to talk about in Hasidism, is the idea of Devekut. Devekut means, or, the Hasidim spoke Yiddish. Most Hasidic books are in Hebrew, but the Hasidim spoke Yiddish. By the way most Hasidic books got written, most Hasidic books, not all, most Hasidic books are arranged according to the weekly Torah portion. The Hasidic master gave a drash on the Torah. They gave a talk, okay, whether it was in Shul Shabbos morning or whether it was Shabbat afternoon. And then I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment, sorry, so you're not distracted. And then their disciples went home after Shabbos and wrote down notes. The Hasidic master may or may not have looked over those notes. Many of those books were written were published after the master's death. Okay. And the master always spoke in Yiddish because people did not speak Hebrew as a daily language. And the disciple wrote these down in Hebrew because when you're reading Torah books for people to study, you write in Hebrew. So there's many steps of translation there. So, did the so-and-so really say this? Okay. We have disciples remembering, writing down. Obviously, when you write things down, you forget certain things, you polish certain other things. Okay. And it goes from Yiddish to Hebrew. So again, all of this is we say the so-and-so said, okay, but it's not 100% clear that the so-and-so said it the way we see it in the book, but we're going to accept that the so-and-so said. Okay. So important idea number one of Hasidut is Devekut. Devek in modern Hebrew means glue. Okay. And lidbok means to stick to. Devekut means cleaving to God. So, core Hasidic idea number one is it is the individual's spiritual religious task to try to cleave to God. So we're going to talk about this. I think this week we don't have any primary sources we're going to look at. Next week we'll have primary sources. This week is just a book about. Okay, Devekut. Okay, I'm going to read. As has been said, the Hasidim could draw upon a very long tradition in relation to Devekut. The concept of Devekut, which occupies such an important position in Hasidic thinking, can already be found in many spiritual traditions from the Middle Ages, although the term had a very different content for Hasidim than the term had been used by medieval philosophers. In the Middle Ages, the term Devekut, or cleaving, now pay attention, the term Devekut, or cleaving, had been used for the ultimate ideal towards which one strove, and only someone who was thoroughly familiar with Torah and tradition, possessed very advanced knowledge, and had spent much time in preparation, could hope at the end of a long and arduous path to be graced with the experience of direct contact with the divine. So I wrote in the margin, who? So who said that only if you're on the highest level of trying to understand God can you actually have some close, not direct, but as close as a human could get, apprehension of God? It's a question for the floor. Who said that? Come on.
Allah.
Say it again.
Kabbalah.
Nope. Maimonides. Right? You never really fully cleave. You can get as close as possible, but this is the end of a process, okay, that requires great, great, great study and cleansing and clear your mind and intellectual apprehension, right? The highest thing that a human possesses is intellect, okay, and God is pure intellect. And so you study in a sophisticated way so that you can apprehend God and you get as close as you can. Okay? Rambam would love the idea of Devekut. He would say, well, you can never quite cleave. Okay, there is always a division. You try to cleave, but that's the end product. And it's reserved for the few because the vast majority of people are not a sophisticated intellect. Hasidism takes this concept and it totally changes. Okay? For the early Hasidim, the state of Devekut was, in that third paragraph of the page, middle of the page, where I have the asterisk, the state of Devekut was no longer the far distant ultimate destination on a long journey, which is Maimonides would have said, but rather the beginning, the point of departure for anyone who yearned for God. This lay within the reach of any Hasid who had a desire to cleave to God. Anyone who was deeply affected by God's omnipresence. We'll talk about God's omnipresence next week. Okay? So every Hasid, which means any person who considers themselves to be part of this religious approach, spiritual approach, should aim to start out from the point of I am in. Now again, we're using words that are translation words, okay, and that are value concepts, so they're a little bit squishy, okay. Attached to, or I know if I say yearning for, which is a part of it, that implies that it's something out there that could be far from me. Yearning for and attached to God. The best English translation is cleaving to, and the best word is Devekut or Dvekus. That's what started me on the Yiddish. Dvekus. Okay? Anyone can do Dvekus, and that's the goal of religious life. It's the goal, but it's also the starting point of religious life. So anything you can, I don't want to say anything, the best you can experience a relationship with God is from a place of I am trying to experience myself as cleaving to God. Last paragraph there, the joie de vivre that the Hasidim demonstrated, which was expressed in singing and dancing among other things, went back to the idea that the creation was the result of a loving act of God towards humans. The background of the Hasidic commandment to joy, we're all used to this, right? Singing, dancing, had everything to do with the realization of God's omnipresence and God's presence in everything that exists and lives. Again, we're going to talk about that more next week. And the technical term for that is panentheism, not pantheism. Pantheism means everything is God. Panentheism means God is in everything. By the way, this is a reworking of certain ideas, right? The Ari, right, by Isaac Lurie, we talked about him, who said that there are divine sparks in everything because the divine light got poured into vessels which broke, the light fragmented. There are fragments of light in everything. They're covered over by husks, right? And that is that is panentheism. There is God in everything. Okay? For the Ari, because there's God in everything, it's covered by husks. It's our job to remove the husks so the light that can return to God. For the Hasidim, who I don't want to say they disagreed with this idea, but their idea was rejoice. There's God in everything. Okay? Sorry, I said it backwards. There's God in everything. Therefore, rejoice. Okay? In your devotion, which you can express through davening, singing, dancing, okay, other things, you can become, I don't want to say attached to, but close, we would call it in English, close to, you can experience a sense of feeling close to God as much of the time as possible. And so the ideal state of, I'm on the second page, constant ecstasy meant that one should be able to sustain the state of Devekut when participating in social life or performing one's daily work. If you were really into this, then you could be in Devekut all the time, okay? And this led to a Hasidic idea called avodah shebegashmiut. Gashmiut means physicality. It's not geshem like rain. It's a different meaning of the word gashmi, which means physical. Okay. And avodah means service of God. We know avodah shebalev, service in the heart, is the rabbinic term for prayer. But the Hasidim said you can serve God with all of your physicality. Now, the second paragraph says, of course, this is really hard to do. Right? Because practically speaking, you can't, for most of us, you can't walk around thinking about the divinity and everything all the time, right? Because you're a shoemaker, okay? So for the Hasidim, they used a term katnut and gadlut. Katnut means katan, from katan, which means small consciousness. Gadlut from gadol, which means great or big. Great consciousness. And Hasidism said, there are moments when we can achieve gadlut. We might call that a heightened, broader, deeper, more intense experience of godliness in the world. We've all had those moments. Sunrise on the mountaintop, a baby being born. The Hasidic masters also talk about things like Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, right? They say, during Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, no one needs to work hard to feel close to God, right? Their assumption was, people have a certain experience of being together and being in shul through all of Yom Kippur. And Gadlut, they sometimes call it, by the way, and this is a Kabbalistic term, Mochin de Katnut and Mochin de Gadlut. Moach means brain, and it means big mind or small mind. Most of the time, we're in Katnut. I'm worried about rushing to work and making a living and doing what I do, okay? Because it's hard to hold on to Mochin de Gadlut, let's call it higher consciousness or deeper consciousness. They called it bigger consciousness, right? So we alternate, and we have moments of having, I'm taking a class now in which the teacher translates some of this as deeper mindfulness, modern meditation-influenced lingo. There are moments where we have deeper consciousness, deeper mindfulness, deeper awareness. And of course, because we're, not spiritual adepts, we lapse out of those moments. And a lot of the time we spend in small consciousness, okay? But we strive to come back, and we kind of toggle back. Here's after the degree of Devekut has been perfected in a state of Gadlut, big consciousness, big mind, and communion with God is experienced in its full intensity, let's say Kol Nidre, okay? Then there follows immediately a falling back into Katnut, small mind, in which this state of cleaving cannot be maintained, because most of us are not so deep. In this lesser state, a person can recover from the demanding ecstatic experience and occupy themselves with normal daily affairs, meaning we as humans can't actually live with every moment of our lives being like Kol Nidre. It's not just that we're incapable, it's that it would not be good for us, okay? But we're always yearning for those moments. We're always yearning to see the sunrise at the top of the mountain and say, wow. But we can't live that way. It actually wouldn't be healthy. It wouldn't work. During the Katnut phase, when you're back in your daily, we would call it quotidian consciousness, the mystic continues to yearn for the perfected Devekut and prepares with renewed effort for a return to the state of Gadlut. Right? 3 times a year Jews, as they say, come to Shul on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. What do they want? They want a peak spiritual experience. They want deep meaning. And then they go back to their daily affairs and they lapse. That is normal. They say that's a normal human condition. When you have bigger consciousness, again, I'm just going to use this as a term, bigger consciousness, that means you are more in a state of Devekut, or cleaving to the ultimate. You're more in tuned with the ultimate. Sorry that I'm using vague language. Then you lapse back into small-mindedness. But of course, you're always yearning to have those peak spiritual moments. Now, last thing at the asterisk, in Hasidic doctrine, this is a major change, which has to do with element number 3 that I said about the perfect storm that led to Hasidism. In Hasidic doctrine, a higher status was ascribed to the attainment of Devekut than to the study of Torah. Meaning, how do you get close to God? By singing and dancing with a band of Hasidim in the forest, and not by sitting in yeshiva. Okay. Now, the paragraph goes on to say, yeah, there were later Hasidim. As Hasidim evolved, there were Hasidim who were great Torah scholars. By the way, legend about the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, 1700, 1760. The legend about him says that he was thought to be illiterate, and he married a woman from a rabbinic family, and her father, was it her father or her brother, I can't remember, was opposed to the marriage because she was marrying an illiterate. And I think at age 36, he came out, the legend, and said, I'm really not illiterate. I'm really like the deepest possible scholar in hiding. And he started to teach Hasidism. This is part of the hagiography of the Baal Shem Tov. So on the one hand, and this is a complicated story in Hasidism, on the one hand, it's not like Hasidism ignored or did away with the importance of study and Torah scholarship. On the other hand, there's a strand of thinking of Hasidut that you don't need any of that to get close to God. Again, this is totally the opposite of Maimonides. Maimonides said it's only the spiritual, intellectual adept who can get closest to God. The rest of the people, we have mitzvot for them just to keep them safe in their daily lives. And Hasidim says, no. Anyone can get close to God. You get close to God by recognizing the godliness in everything in the world. And if you recognize the godliness in everything in the world, in the person in front of you, in cooking the meal for your family, okay, for example, then of course you're joyful, okay, because there's holiness all around you. And it's just up to you to see that, recognize that, realize that. And if you realize that, how could you not be joyful? You're in a state of Devekut. By the way, footnote, a lot of the Hasidic masters talk about pessimism and depression. Some of them had periods of depression. The most famous one, they say, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav had bipolar disorder, manic depressive illness. And many of them struggled. They recognized that, I'm going to say, the enemy of this kind of consciousness was despair. I had a conversation with a young person. Young just means I'm 66. It means less than 66. A young person, person of a younger generation yesterday. They were depressed, the inauguration, etc. They said the world, what's the point? What's the point? Okay, so that's a kind of despair. And Hasidut recognized that despair was the enemy of this kind of joy. Okay, if you despair, it's hard for you to experience the joy of God is in everyone and everything, and that means holiness, potentially, is in every act that I do, potentially. Now, because Hasidism knew you can't live in Kol Nidre consciousness all the time. You can't always live in Mochin de Gadlut, big mind. By the way, there's a modern Israeli secular version of this. They call it Rosh Gadol and Rosh Katan, right? Rosh Gadol means you have a big head. It means you got a broad perspective on things. Rosh Katan means you're just looking at I'm watching the clock and I got to get through the next hour. Okay? It means a lot of things, Rosh Katan, but it means small consciousness and big consciousness. So Hasidism said, I'm going to wrap up with this and then we'll leave time for questions, comments, that everyone is capable of this. This is not for deeply learned scholars. It's not necessarily the end point. It can be the starting point. And the religious life, the spiritual life, the Jewish life is meant to be experiencing this as intensely and deeply and often as possible. Okay? And because they had an awareness of human nature, they generally didn't worry that people would become monks and go live in a cave and do this all the time, because they generally understood that people are not capable of maintaining this all the time. And we'll read some passages in coming weeks about davening in particular, about the fact that your concentration lapses in davening, or that davening can become rote because it's the same prayers every day, meaning the things that potentially get in the way of having higher consciousness. And I think we'll get to a rabbi called the Piazetzner, who wrote in the 1920s, who talked about how our consciousness of life and the vitality of our soul become dulled, D-U-L-L-E-D, become dulled. And thus we have difficulty experiencing this because we are dulled. Okay. We're like someone who, hasn't read a book in a long time, who sits down to read a book and says, gosh, there's just I don't know. There's so many words here. I don't have the patience for it. Right. We become dulled. And that is kind of the enemy of the Piazetzner actually talks about no one feels dulled during Kol Nidre. This is an example that's used by a lot of Hasidic masters, right? Or when someone is suffering some great sadness, okay? No one feels that their soul is dulled. They're naturally in a state of sadness. They feel alive. And by the way, the Hasidim talk about that there are states of joy and states of sadness that can bring this. States of joy, states of need, states of sadness, where we naturally feel more alive and connected to the world, right? And there's a complicated thing. They distinguish between sadness and despair. Someone I love died, okay? That brings on a state of sadness. That's different than despair. Despair means, why bother? I won't do anything. I'll just collapse. So that's a lot. It's a lot, okay? So I want to summarize idea number one in Hasidut, which we will in weeks ahead connect to davening, but you can already see how this is potentially connectable to davening, is that the goal of religious life is Devekut, cleaving to God. It's the goal, but it's the starting point. Anyone can do it. We recognize that it's impossible to achieve all the time, okay? But it's what is potentially achievable theoretically all the time, but we know not really, because human beings are human beings, and we will always lapse back into small consciousness, and we're striving for peak moments of vitality when we feel, now I'll speak California, okay, peak moments of soul vitality, peak moments of soul vitality when we feel attuned to and at one with the universe. That's the California translation. Okay? For the Chassid, it would be moments of Devekut when we are experiencing a closeness to the divine. Okay. I'm going to pause. Try to wrap it up by 9. 3 minutes. Thoughts, questions, comments? It's appealing. It's not appealing. What do you think?
Hi, this is Carl Sunshine.
Hi, Carl.
I say thank you, and this is my first time here for a long time, so I'm
Okay.
very happy
Okay.
joining you. A question, comment, which I'm sure we'll get to in subsequent weeks because it's a big question. So, signing up for this regime requires you to at least have enough positive outlook, hopeful outlook to see that there can be aspects of God in everything, and
Yeah.
you can see and appreciate them. So, how did they bring people into the movement who were of a basically a pessimistic, negativistic, cynical attitude, or did they just write them off and say, you're lost?
I think the short answer might be they said, come daven, sing, and dance and eat with us. I think that is their short answer, right? I guess I'm thinking on my feet here, Carl, and maybe a more sophisticated version of that would be if you make an effort to connect yourself to a place and to people who are experiencing this, then it can be somewhat infectious, right? So we've all had the experience of being in some place or situation which you feel was, I'm going to put it in air quotes, an elevated experience. By the way, that's another word, another synonym for godlut, right? Elevated experience. And you feel yourself sort of swept up in it. I think of, some of the davening experiences that, Rabbi Kligfeld and team have tried to create at Temple Beth Am, or, when you're in some shul where, I don't know, the daven. Now, yeah, you have to know a modicum. You sort of helpful to know the melody, and it's helpful to know a few of the words, and that takes repetition. Okay. And you might not get swept up in it if you walked in the first time, although you might. We certainly know plenty of people who have, right? Who walk into a certain shul for the first time and they say, okay, I'm home, right? And we know young people, 15-year-olds and 20-year-olds, whose usually souls are more alive than ours, maybe for biological reasons. They're into their music and their concerts and their, I don't know, I think 20 years ago it was called trance parties, but, and by the way, and people, of course, I forgot to mention drugs, right? Modern Americans, like lots of peoples from long ago, sometimes use drugs to try to attain these states, right? But people will say like, no, ecstatic dance parties. It's to try to achieve that level, but without drugs. So I guess that's a longer answer. Sorry. I think it's you try to attach yourselves to other people who seem to be having this experience. Now, they do talk about despair and blockages and soul blockages, because many of these Hasidic masters, as I said, did experience obstacles and blockages, and they do talk about them, how to move beyond your soul blockages. I'll try to include some texts that address that. Right.
Okay, so thank you.
Sure, they do try to address, well, what if this isn't your natural starting point, right? And that is, okay, join the right Hasidic group and see what they do and see if you get swept away, somewhat swept away, temporarily swept away in it. And if you don't, by the way, there were different Hasidic masters. They had different approaches. And there are all kinds of stories about a Hasid who, they attached themselves to the court of this Hasidic master, but then they moved to the court of that Hasidic master because a different approach spoke to them differently. By the way, and some of them were more into nigunim and music, and some of them were more into davening, and some later ones earlier in the 20th century were more into breathing meditations and silence. So there was a recognition that there are different routes to get there, and not all routes work for everyone. Other question, comment? I don't want to cut people off. We can take another couple of minutes. We don't have to. I'll wait a moment. Okay, let's wrap up for this week. which was about Devekut, cleaving to God as a core idea of Hasidism. And we'll see in some subsequent weeks in specific ways some of the specific writings about how that's actually connected to davening practice. Okay, have a good day, stay healthy, pray for world peace.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.